If someone knocked on your door in the middle of
Is
the
someone
night
out
during a
there?
war, would you risk your life
I
by
think I
opening it?
see you.
Or spend the rest of your
Wo
life
ist der
wondering who you
Mann?
left
Ich
outside?
weiß es nicht.
Imagine discovering that the
Lügnerin, sag die
person
Wahrheit!
struggling
Ich
to
kann
stay on
nicht.
his feet was supposed to be your enemy, yet the fear in his eyes looked exactly like your own. Now imagine knowing that
Herauskommen.
one decision
Sofort.
made in the
Hier
next
ist
10
niemand.
seconds could send you
Durchsuchen.
to
Was
prison,
versteckst du?
condemn your
Nichts.
family, or quietly
I have to
disappear
go
into
now.
history with no
Please
one
be
ever
safe.
learning what really
I
happened.
will. I promise.
What would make an ordinary person
This
choose
moment is
compassion
perfect.
when every
With you,
rule
it
demanded
always is.
obedience?
I love
And why
you.
would a single
you
night
too.
remain unforgettable long after the guns fell silent? The answer began with nothing more dramatic than 3 slow knocks against an old wooden door. By the spring of 1945, Anna Keller had learned that silence could be louder than explosions. At 22 years old, she lived alone in the small house her parents had left behind after illness, and war had taken nearly everything else. The workshop attached to the home still held dozens of unfinished clocks built by her father, their hands forever frozen at different moments, as though time itself had decided it no longer belonged there. Every evening, she wound the few clocks that still worked, swept the sawdust from the worn wooden floor, and carefully rationed what little bread and potatoes remained in the pantry. The war had taught her to expect less each week than she had the week before. She no longer counted victories or defeats. She counted candles, buckets of water, and the number of nights that passed without strangers at the door. Outside, the narrow street emptied before sunset. Curtains closed early. Windows stayed dark. Neighbors spoke in whispers if they spoke at all. No one wanted attention. No one wanted questions. Even the wind seemed to move more carefully through the broken rooftops. Anna had developed habits without realizing it. Before sleeping, she checked the latch twice. She covered every crack where light might escape through the curtains. She listened for footsteps before blowing out the lamp. That evening felt no different until the sound came. 3 slow knocks. Not hurried, not desperate, deliberate enough to make her freeze with one hand still resting on the lamp. She waited. Nothing followed. Then came another knock, softer this time, almost as if whoever stood outside no longer had the strength to lift a hand. Anna remained perfectly still, her heartbeat filling the quiet room, while every lesson fear had ever taught her insisted that the safest door was the one that never opened. Anna did not move immediately. Her father had once told her that fear always demanded a quick answer, while wisdom usually asked for one more moment of silence. She stood beside the door, listening. No voices drifted through the cold night. No engines rumbled along the empty road. Only the faint sound of someone breathing on the other side, slow and uneven, as though every breath had become a careful decision. She reached for the small curtain covering the front window and lifted one corner with trembling fingers. Moonlight revealed the outline of a young man leaning against the porch railing. His uniform was dusty, his jacket darkened by rain and mud, and one sleeve hung awkwardly, as if he could no longer lift his arm without effort. He was not holding a weapon. In fact, the rifle resting against the porch post seemed almost forgotten. His head remained lowered, and for a brief second, he looked less like a soldier than a traveler who had wandered farther than he ever intended. Anna had seen enough uniforms during the war to recognize the difference immediately. He was American. Every warning she had ever heard rushed back at once. Stay away. Report them. Do not speak. Do not help. The rules had been repeated so often they no longer sounded like instructions. They sounded like the natural order of the world. Yet the figure outside did not match the terrifying stories she had grown up hearing. He looked exhausted, young, frightened, human. Another quiet breath escaped him before he slowly lifted one hand, not to knock again, but simply to keep himself from slipping against the railing. Anna rested her forehead against the cool glass. She thought of the empty chair where her father used to repair watches under the warm glow of an oil lamp. He had never spoken much about politics. Instead, he had repeated a different lesson every evening while adjusting tiny brass gears. He would smile and say that every clock was built differently, but every heart deserved the same careful hands. She had not understood those words as a child. Tonight they returned with startling clarity. Her fingers tightened around the latch. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked another passing hour. She realized that if anyone happened to see an American soldier standing on her porch after midnight, explanations would no longer matter. Even so, she slowly unlocked the door. The old hinges gave a quiet creak as the door opened only a few inches. The young man looked up with pale blue eyes clouded by exhaustion. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, in careful English, barely louder than a whisper, he managed 4 simple words. "Please, I need shelter." The words hung in the cold air between them. They were spoken quietly, almost apologetically, as though he expected the answer to be no. Anna studied his face without saying a word. He looked no older than 25. Rain clung to his hair, and the faint light from her lamp revealed deep circles beneath tired eyes that had clearly gone too many nights without proper sleep. She noticed something else that surprised her even more. He never tried to step forward. He remained outside, waiting for her decision as though he understood that crossing the threshold without permission would destroy the only chance he had left. The silence stretched so long that even the ticking clock behind Anna seemed unusually loud. Finally, she opened the door just wide enough for one person to pass. "Quickly," she whispered in careful English. The young soldier nodded once before stepping inside with slow, deliberate movements. He removed his boots immediately, placing them beside the door without being asked. The gesture felt strangely ordinary, almost like a guest visiting a neighbor instead of an exhausted stranger seeking refuge during wartime. Anna closed the door, slid the wooden bolt into place, and stood listening again. Nothing stirred outside. The street remained wrapped in darkness. The soldier glanced around the modest home without curiosity. His eyes lingered only long enough to understand where he was before lowering respectfully toward the floor. "Thank you," he said softly. "My name is Daniel Carter." His voice carried the gentle accent of the American Midwest, calm despite the uncertainty surrounding him. Anna hesitated before answering. Speaking her own name suddenly felt like offering something valuable. "Anna Keller," she replied. Daniel gave a small nod, careful not to ask another question. He seemed to recognize that trust could not be hurried. Anna pointed toward the wooden kitchen table beside the stove. "Sit." He obeyed immediately. As he lowered himself onto the chair, he drew a slow breath, closing his eyes for only a moment before opening them again. The room was warm compared to the damp night outside. A cast iron stove glowed softly, filling the house with the comforting scent of burning oak. Copper pots hung neatly above the counter. Shelves held only a few jars of preserved vegetables, carefully arranged to last as long as possible. Everything reflected quiet discipline rather than comfort. Anna filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. Neither of them spoke while they waited for it to warm. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the steady ticking of the clocks surrounding them. Daniel slowly reached inside his jacket, and Anna instinctively stiffened. Instead of drawing a weapon, he carefully removed a folded family photograph protected inside a worn leather wallet. He looked at it for only a second before slipping it back into place. In that brief movement, Anna realized something unexpected. He had carried memories farther than he had carried fear. The kettle began to sing softly before either of them found another word to say. Anna poured the hot water into 2 plain ceramic cups, adding a handful of dried herbs she had been saving for colder days. The faint aroma drifted through the kitchen, carrying a warmth that had become rare in recent months. She placed 1 cup in front of Daniel, then returned to the stove without watching whether he accepted it. Trust, she understood, often grew best when it was left alone. Daniel wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat settle into his fingers before taking the smallest sip. His shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, as though the simple act of drinking something warm reminded him that ordinary life still existed somewhere beyond uniforms and marching orders. Anna opened a narrow cabinet beside the stove and removed half a loaf of dark rye bread along with a small piece of white cheese wrapped carefully in cloth. It was not much. In another season, it would barely have counted as a meal. Yet she sliced both evenly, placing the larger portion on Daniel's plate without thinking. Only after sitting across from him did she realize what she had done. Daniel noticed it as well. Without a word, he quietly exchanged the slices, returning the larger piece to her side of the table. Anna looked up. Daniel simply smiled, a tired smile that reached his eyes for only a moment before fading. Neither argued. They shared the meal exactly as it now rested between them. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window panes while the old clocks continued marking seconds that neither of them could ever reclaim. After several minutes, Daniel glanced toward the shelves filled with unfinished timepieces. Your father? He asked carefully. Anna followed his eyes. He repaired clocks, she answered. Every house in this town once knew his work. Daniel nodded slowly. My father repaired tractors on our farm in Ohio. He believed every machine deserved patience before replacement. Anna allowed herself the smallest smile. Then perhaps our fathers would have understood each other. The thought lingered quietly between them. Different countries, different languages, the same habit of repairing broken things instead of throwing them away. Daniel reached instinctively toward the pocket where he had earlier returned the family photograph, then stopped himself. Instead, he rested both hands on the table. Anna noticed that he was careful never to make sudden movements, careful never to let fear become threatening. She realized he was protecting her comfort as much as his own safety. The realization unsettled her more than anything she had expected that night. The stories she had heard for years left little room for gestures like these. As the fire settled into glowing embers, the house no longer felt occupied by strangers. It felt occupied by two weary people borrowing a few quiet hours from a world that had almost forgotten how to be gentle. The peaceful rhythm of the house lasted only a few minutes before another sound cut through the night. It came from far down the street at first, almost hidden beneath the falling rain. Boots. Slow, steady, unmistakable. Anna raised her head before Daniel noticed them. Living through years of uncertainty had sharpened her hearing in ways she had never wanted. The footsteps grew louder, joined by the faint creak of wagon wheels and the distant murmur of voices. Someone was moving from house to house. Daniel immediately understood. He carefully placed his cup back onto the table without making a sound. His eyes searched the room, not for an escape, but for Anna. He would not move unless she told him to. That single choice spoke louder than anything either of them had said all evening. Anna crossed the room and gently opened the narrow pantry door beside the kitchen. Behind the shelves of preserves stood another wooden panel, almost invisible beneath years of dust and worn paint. Her father had built it decades earlier to protect valuable clocks during times of theft. Very few people even knew it existed. She pulled the hidden latch, revealing a narrow storage space between two walls. It was barely wide enough for one person to stand. Daniel looked at the opening, then back at Anna. Only if you are certain, he whispered. Anna answered with the smallest nod. Go. He stepped inside carefully, making sure not to disturb a single shelf. Before Anna closed the panel, Daniel quietly removed the leather wallet from his pocket and held it for a second, as though considering whether to leave it behind. Instead, he slipped it back inside his jacket. Some memories, she realized, were the last possessions a person could never risk losing. The panel clicked softly into place just as the footsteps stopped outside her house. A heavy knock echoed against the front door. Anna drew one slow breath and walked toward it with measured steps. She paused only long enough to smooth the front of her apron before lifting the latch. Two local patrolmen stood beneath the porch roof, rain glistening on their coats. One of them removed his cap politely. Good evening, he said. We are checking every home. An American soldier has been reported somewhere nearby. Have you seen anyone unusual tonight? Anna met his eyes without hesitation. No, she answered calmly. Only the rain. The older patrolman glanced past her shoulder into the warm kitchen. His eyes rested on the second cup still sitting on the table. For one endless heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Anna looked at the untouched cup before returning her gaze to him. I made tea for myself, she said quietly. The second cup helps keep it warm. The explanation sounded almost ordinary. The patrolman studied her face for another moment, then slowly nodded. Very well. Lock your door tonight. Anna thanked him politely and waited until the footsteps faded back into the darkness before allowing herself the first full breath she had taken in several minutes. Anna remained by the door until even the echo of the footsteps had dissolved into the rain. Only then did she slide the wooden bolt back into place and rest one hand against the weathered frame. Her heart was still racing, yet the house had returned to complete silence. She crossed the kitchen without hurry and opened the hidden panel once more. Daniel stepped out carefully, blinking as though he had forgotten what an ordinary room looked like. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed too small after the danger had passed so closely. Finally, Daniel released a slow breath. You could have sent me away, he said quietly. You would have been safer. Anna looked toward the dying fire before answering. Safer is not always the same as right. Daniel lowered his eyes, absorbing the sentence as though it carried more weight than she intended. She added another piece of oak to the stove, and fresh flames slowly climbed through the glowing embers, filling the room with soft amber light. Shadows from the old clocks stretched across the walls, gently shifting with every movement of the fire. It reminded Anna of evenings long before the war, when her father worked late into the night while neighbors stopped by simply to talk. Those memories felt impossibly distant now, yet for a few quiet minutes they seemed close enough to touch. Daniel removed the folded photograph from his wallet once again. This time he placed it on the table between them. Anna saw an older couple standing beside a white farmhouse, smiling into bright summer sunlight. A young boy held a fishing pole while a little girl laughed beside him. "My family," Daniel said softly. "This was taken 2 summers before I left." Anna studied the picture with gentle curiosity. Nothing about it resembled the enemy she had imagined throughout the war. It looked like any family that might have lived on the next street if history had chosen another path. She walked to a nearby shelf and opened a small wooden box. Inside rested one carefully preserved photograph of her own. She placed it beside Daniel's. Her parents stood outside the clock shop, smiling with quiet pride while 12-year-old Anna held a tiny pocket watch her father had just finished repairing. Daniel compared the 2 photographs and smiled faintly. "Different languages," he said, "but the same kind of family." Anna nodded. "My father believed broken things deserved another chance before anyone gave up on them." Daniel looked toward the rows of silent clocks surrounding the room. "Mine used to say almost the same thing about people." They shared a quiet laugh, soft enough not to disturb the sleeping town beyond the walls. In that simple exchange, something invisible changed. The uniforms remained. The war still existed outside. Yet inside the small house, 2 strangers had stopped seeing each other through the stories they had been taught, and had quietly begun seeing the ordinary human being sitting across the table. The first pale light of morning slowly gathered beyond the curtains, softening the edges of a night neither of them would ever forget. Rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving tiny drops clinging to the window panes like scattered pieces of glass. Anna stood quietly beside the front door, listening to the silence outside. The town was beginning to wake. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called across empty fields. A wagon rolled slowly over damp cobblestones. Ordinary sounds were returning, and with them came the certainty that Daniel could not remain much longer. She turned back toward the kitchen. Daniel had already risen from his chair. Somehow he looked stronger than he had only a few hours earlier, although exhaustion still rested behind his eyes. The warmth of the house had restored his strength just enough to continue moving forward. He carefully folded the family photograph and returned it to his wallet before slipping the worn leather back into his pocket. Neither of them hurried. They both understood that delaying the moment by another minute would not change what had to happen. Anna walked to a small cabinet near her father's workbench and removed a neatly wrapped bundle. Inside were 2 slices of rye bread, a piece of cheese, and a small apple she had saved for herself later in the week. She held it out, without ceremony. Daniel looked at the package before looking back at her. "You should keep this," he said gently. "You need it more than I do." Anna shook her head. "You have farther to travel." He accepted the bundle with quiet gratitude, holding it as though it weighed far more than food alone. Before either of them reached the door, Daniel paused beside the workbench. He slowly unfastened the military wristwatch from his arm. The leather strap showed years of careful use, while the scratched crystal reflected the first rays of morning. He placed it on the wooden surface beside one of the unfinished clocks. Anna immediately pushed it back toward him. "No," she said softly. "You will need that." Daniel smiled with calm certainty. "I know where I am going," he answered. "This will help me remember where kindness found me." Anna hesitated. The watch represented far more than time. It carried the miles he had traveled, the uncertainty he had survived, and the hope that had led him to her door. At last she accepted it, not as payment and not as a promise, but as proof that one quiet night had truly happened. Daniel opened the front door just enough to step outside. The cool morning air rushed gently into the house. He turned once more before leaving. "If I make it home," he said, "I will never forget this place." Anna did not answer immediately. She simply offered a small, steady smile that carried more faith than words ever could. Then Daniel walked down the narrow road. growing smaller with every step until the morning mist quietly welcomed him beyond her sight. 3 years passed quietly, not because life had become easy, but because people slowly learned how to live beside memories that refused to leave. The spring of 1948 brought fresh paint to abandoned buildings, children back into schoolyards, and the steady sound of hammers replacing the echoes of distant artillery. Anna remained in the same small house, where every clock still seemed to remember the hands that had built it. She repaired the unfinished pieces her father had left behind, one careful gear at a time, earning just enough to keep the workshop alive. On a narrow shelf above her workbench rested a single military wristwatch. She never wore it. Every Sunday morning, she wound it gently before placing it back in exactly the same spot. It became less a reminder of one visitor than a quiet reminder that even in the darkest seasons, people could still surprise one another. Across the Atlantic, Daniel Carter had returned to Ohio with stories he rarely shared. Friends asked about battles, long marches, and difficult days overseas, yet the memory that returned most often was not one of those. It was a modest kitchen warmed by an oak stove, 2 cups of herbal tea, and a stranger who had chosen mercy over fear. He resumed helping on his family's farm, repaired tractors beside his father, and tried to settle into ordinary routines. Still, whenever rain tapped softly against the windows at night, he found himself thinking about a small German town whose name he had never forgotten. After saving enough money, Daniel made a decision that puzzled nearly everyone around him. He traveled back across the ocean, carrying only a small suitcase and a folded piece of paper on which he had carefully written the address from memory. The streets looked different now. Rubble had disappeared. New storefronts stood where damaged buildings once had. Children laughed in places that had once been silent. Yet when he reached the familiar lane, his steps slowed. The workshop still stood. Fresh flowers rested beneath the front window. The same weathered sign hung above the door, although the paint had faded with time. Daniel remained outside for several moments, uncertain whether to knock. Perhaps she had moved away. Perhaps she no longer remembered. Perhaps she would prefer the past to remain exactly where it belonged. Before he could decide, the front door opened. Anna stepped onto the porch carrying a small wooden box filled with clock parts. She looked toward the gate, expecting no one in particular. Their eyes met across the quiet garden. Neither smiled immediately. Recognition arrived first, followed by disbelief, and finally by the gentle certainty that some promises were kept not through grand declarations, but simply because one person had never stopped remembering another. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The years between them seemed to disappear, leaving only the memory of a quiet kitchen, a warm stove, and 2 strangers who had chosen trust over fear. Daniel was the first to speak. "I was not sure this house would still be here," he said with a gentle smile. Anna looked at him, then at the familiar path leading to her front door. "Neither was I," she replied softly. "Some days, I thought only the clocks remembered." A quiet laugh escaped them both, light enough to carry away the last trace of uncertainty. Anna invited him inside without ceremony, just as she had years before. The workshop smelled of polished wood and machine oil, exactly as Daniel remembered. Sunlight streamed through the windows, falling across dozens of restored clocks, each one ticking with calm determination. The unfinished pieces that had once gathered dust now stood complete on wooden shelves. Time, it seemed, had finally begun moving again. Daniel noticed the military wristwatch resting in its familiar place above the workbench. It had been carefully polished, but its worn leather strap remained unchanged. Anna followed his eyes. "It still keeps perfect time," she said. Daniel smiled. "I hoped it would." They spent the afternoon talking not about battles or politics, but about ordinary things. The harvest on Daniel's family farm. The children who now played in the rebuilt streets. The customers who brought old clocks to Anna, hoping forgotten treasures could live again. They discovered that peace was built much the same way as a fine clock, one careful piece at a time, with patience greater than pride. Before sunset, Daniel prepared to leave once more. This time, there was no fear waiting beyond the door, only a long journey home. He reached into his suitcase and carefully placed a small wooden box on the workbench. Inside rested a polished brass nameplate engraved with simple words, "For the Keller Clock Shop, so people will know it should never disappear." Anna traced the letters with her fingertips, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "No, thank you for reminding me that courage is not always found on a battlefield." Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the open windows, while every clock in the workshop continued its steady rhythm. As Daniel walked down the lane one final time, he looked back only once. Anna stood in the doorway exactly as she had years earlier, calm, composed, and quietly strong. She raised one hand in farewell, and he answered the gesture before continuing toward the waiting road. Some people change history with speeches. Others do it with victories. But every once in a while, an ordinary person changes a single human heart, and that is enough to echo across a lifetime. She never raised her voice. She simply raised the standard of what it meant to remain human.